Chapter 20 Last Stand of the Wolf. The warm months had seemed wonderful to Reddy, but when, with winter, one snow after the other, came to clutter up the trails, the sub-zero weather hung day after day over the mountains. He found it difficult to keep from freezing, unless he stayed in the spruce thickets where there was no wind, and he could make a comfortable bed by burrowing under the snow. His coat had grown thick and long, but it lacked the heavy fur which covered the wolves, and it was not much protection to his feet. Nevertheless, he was contented. Food was always obtainable, for hunting was still good as well as exciting. Besides smaller game, the moose had congregated along the banks of the little river, and the sheep had come down from the bleak cliffs to live in the upper edge of the timber. Late each afternoon, he and the king would come out of their cozy thicket to go scouting, first among the deep paths of the moose, and then up through the timber to the higher benches, where the sheep and sometimes the woolly white goats could be waylaid before they took alarm and dashed to the safety of the precipices. More often now, it was Reddy who took the lead, for the big wolf, who was beginning to show gray about his muzzle, was finding that he often missed his hold when he tried to seize and throw his quarry. To a wolf, nothing was more important than good teeth, and the king's were not nearly as sharp as formerly. Hard usage had worn them down. Without help from a companion, he would have had a hard time that winter. Reddy sensed the change, and who could not say that he had not sensed it dimly when he was far away in Florida? But the big wolf's old-time spirit was still there, showing itself in everything that he did, driving him to try again and again to hunt and fight in just the same way as always. He had lorded it over the wolves for such a long time that they rarely questioned his strength and fitness. His supremacy was almost a tradition, and would remain so, until, by some mischance, some trick of fate, the wolves were able to see that he was failing. When that time came, they would turn on him in a body and show no mercy. 2 Indians ran a line of traps through King's chosen territory that winter, and made a big catch of fox, beaver, mink, and ermine. Their traps were small, and at first they did not try for coyotes and wolves. But the thieving coyotes soon learned to rob the traps of the toothsome fur-bearers, and almost forced the men to do something about it. Retribution came in the form of wire snares, and no one knew better than the Indians how to set these cruel contrivances. Almost uncannily they picked out the best trails, and made sets here and there until the forest bristled with them, and the king began to worry and hesitate to go charging through his old domain in his hunting. Sometimes he would come across a coyote strangling frantically from a wire, or the body of one hanging lifeless in the air. More often he would turn aside just in time to miss being caught himself, or he would see Reddy in danger. There was nothing for him and Reddy to do except move, and so move they did, 15 miles up the river and into the territory of one of the wolf packs where there was no scent of man, white or red. Here they found few animals to hunt, and much trouble with the wolves, who came to share in all of their hunting. And so again they moved, and kept moving from place to place, until they came to a valley that exactly suited them. There was a fair-sized stream, dammed here and there by beavers. There was a wonderful moose yard, with paths through the willows as numerous as streets in a little town. The king trotted in a great circle to make sure that there were no signs of man, and then he led Reddy part way up a mountain to a heavy wooded basin where the two could make warm beds in safety. Below them they could see the dark bodies of the moose moving among the bushes, and around them the flocks of mountain sheep and goats. Except for the cold, it was ideal. Reddy caught and ate his first beaver in this valley. The busy creatures, in order to reach the best willows, had made a little road from a spot in the stream where the warm spring kept the ice away. Up the slope a distance of more than 50 yards. At night they shuffled up the road to cut down willows with their chisel teeth, and haul branches from small logs down to the water, and under the ice to keep the entrance of their houses, in front of which they could store them in the water until the bark was needed for food. Reddy and the wolf, while scouting hungrily one evening, heard the beaver noisily gnawing and stalked him. He'd caught their scent and had run down his road to the waterhole, but Reddy, who was nearest, burst upon him from a snow-covered evergreen, and found to his surprise that he was the size and shape of a porcupine. He had no sharp quills, and he was very good food. Until the beavers became too wary, he and the king caught one every night. After that, the two explored the mountains and found several big caves from which the odor was evident that goats stayed during stormy weather, and a smaller one in which a grizzly was sleeping peacefully behind a bank of snow. The warm spring used by the beavers contained salts, of the kind craved by hooved animals, which accounted for the presence of so many moose, and for the paths leading to it from many directions, bringing others from the deer tribe of neighboring valleys, even in this time of deep snow. The king knew from experience that the game paths such as these would sooner or later bring danger too, so he was always on guard. Nevertheless, life in this little valley was quiet and happy for many days. The change came very suddenly on a blustery afternoon in March. Without warning, the valley was suddenly, seemingly full of running wolves. Gaunt, ravenous, alien wolves from the far north, such as rarely were seen. They scattered the moose, which Reddy and the king had not molested, killing one and sending the others tearing through the lower forest. They climbed the cliffs and charged the flock of goats that clustered in one of the big caves, killing right and left anything that could not escape to the precipices. And over each carcass they fought. They ran up and down all the game paths, hunting anything and everything that could be eaten. They even attacked the sleeping grizzly. Then, still ravenous and almost rabid, they found Reddy and the king. A dozen of them came swiftly loping into the basin and immediately surrounded the two, closing in on them without formality and attacking, just as if, because they were safe in numbers, they expected to kill or bully every animal in their way. The king and Reddy backed up against a mass of interlacing spruce branches side by side and went to work with a will to chop up any crazed wolf that wanted to fight. One after the other charged them recklessly, only to be slashed or mauled and go back to howling. The king's legs were wide apart and bent in a half crouch, his great head ready to strike as quick as the snake's whenever he saw his chance. Reddy, too, crouched to protect the lower parts of his body and showed his formidable array of teeth in a white range as he met and hurled back one wolf after another. Snarls, growls, and howls, deep and terrible, or shrill and piercing, filled the air, and the snow became filthy with blood and hair from the rolling dark bodies. In their hurry and crazed fury, the wolves made one mistake. The place being narrow, they usually charged singly, thus giving the pair the chance to work together instead of separately. When the king caught by a fighting wolf on the left side of the head, Reddy would slash to the right that was unprotected, and sometimes nearly shear off an ear. Then the king would send the wolf rolling, and there was no time to get into a clinch to the death with any wolf. With such a crowd of frantic creatures to swarm on top of the combatants, anything of that kind would have been fatal. The noise brought up more wolves and fresh attacks, and soon made the little basin a seething center of excitement in the valley. But this could not last indefinitely. The wild horde was finding the fight too tough and long drawn out to be any fun, so all at once it was nervously scattering and quitting the valley, with as much of a rush as that in which it had been invaded, leaving Reddy and the king so breathless and exhausted that they could scarcely have held their own any longer. For some time they lay panting and cooling off, at the same time licking their wounds. They got to their feet and stiffly walked about to sniff the relics of the battle. Twice the king flopped down in the snow but rose again. The third time he went down and stayed there, trying vainly to reach with his tongue a wound on his right side, behind his great ribs. At first Reddy did not know anything was really wrong, but presently he came to investigate, and lay down beside his companion to lick away the dark blood that oozed from a small hole in the rough skin. It was a deep hole that was not just through the flesh, but in the abdominal cavity where his tongue could not enter and staunch the bleeding. He licked and licked, but still the blood trickled slowly. At last, however, the hair plastered over the little hole, seeming to heal it, and Reddy stood up again, but the wolf remained lying there, gazing across the valley to the mountains beyond, with a strange, faraway look. Reddy stood beside him and looked too, but all he could see were the tops of the evergreen trees, and beyond them the seemingly endless mountains under their blanket of snow. Late that night Reddy left the king's side and wandered into the valley, where everything was defiled by the tracks and stench of this alien horde. Gone were the moose and the other big animals. However, in a remote corner, he found a lone porcupine on its solemn way from a cozy cleft in the rocks to a jack pine whose bark was one of his favorite foods. And once more he was forced by necessity to brave the villainous barbs and make a meal of the quill pig. One mouthful he carried all the way back to the black wolf, who took it in his jaws but laid it down beside him. Soon afterward the wolf rose stiffly and walked to a better resting place, in a spruce thicket where he stayed 3 days without moving more than a few yards. Early on the fourth evening, when the air remained tempered by hot sun of midday, the king raised himself from his bed and started in a slow walk down the valley, and then across to the mountains beyond. The mountains at which he'd been gazing. He took the easiest way, along moose paths wherever he could find a beaten trail, until well up among the rocks in one of the mountain passes. Here he dropped down in the snow and stayed until the following noon, with the hound curled up beside him, shivering from head to foot. It was very much the same on the following night, and the next, and during many more nights, though each time he went a shorter distance until he moved only a few yards at a time. Always he headed in the same direction, east, and always he traveled as if in a dream, scarcely turning his nose to the right or left. Reddy hunted hard. The snow was melting fast in the daytime and freezing as soon as the sun set. Running was easy now, and Reddy ran as he'd never run before, partly because the deer, sheep, and goats were able to go fast too, and partly because his nerves were on edge, and he wanted to forget that once great, wonderful companion, now lying almost always among rocks and bushes, instead of bounding beside him or in the lead. When he made a kill, he ate sparingly, and carried pieces of the meat to King, who sometimes ate, and sometimes just mouthed the food and dropped it. It was water the wolf seemed to crave, for he ate little pieces of snow throughout the day and night. Reddy did not make a kill every day. Usually he returned again and again to the same carcass, until he or the coyotes, or eagles and wolverines, had finished it. Sometimes Reddy fought the coyotes, and chased them for many miles through the mountains, but his heart was not in the work, and he did not care whether he caught them. The king was terribly thin, almost like a skeleton, with black matted fur draped over the poor bones. Reddy too was thin, though his muscles were hard, and his thick coat smooth and well kept as ever. Often he threw himself beside his comrade and tried to lick his fur into shape, but almost immediately it would be rough and matted again. The worst time they had was in crossing streams. The ice was broken up, and the water from the snowfields often flooding the banks. But somehow the wolf would win his way across and lie on the far bank, slowly licking the drops out of his fur until he was ready to move on a little further. April was nearly over when they came over a pass and could look down at a wide valley, well wooded and somehow inviting. There was much less snow here, and little sign of ice in the river that wound through the mazes of the forest. It was a broad river for the mountains, and where it was not white with foam and spray, it looked blue in the early morning light. The king dropped down to his stomach and lay for hours looking at the valley, and at last there was a peacefulness in his pose, and something like the old gleam in his eyes. Toward evening, Reddy left him to go hunting, and when he returned, the wolf was no longer there. Nose to the earth, Reddy trailed him down a slope, a short distance, and then to the right among the rocks, in a steep canyon where the footing was very precarious. But the wolf appeared to know his way, for he'd gone to a narrow path that led along the face of a cliff. Here Reddy saw him, almost dragging his body along the ledge, stopping to rest, and then, with an indomitable spirit, dragging himself further. Suddenly he stopped as if exhausted and lay for some time. But again he half rose and forced himself forward. When Reddy looked again, he was no longer visible, and the hound, searching the rocks vainly, was confused and frightened. He edged his way along the ledge, and found that it ended where the wolf had last been. Reddy looked down the face of the cliff, and his legs began to tremble. He turned away, but he caught a trace of the wolf's scent. And quickly searching, he discovered a fissure in the decaying rock, a narrow cave which bore signs of having been at one time enlarged by some animal. Lying within the cave, facing the entrance, his nose on his paws, lay the great wolf. Reddy stood there as if petrified, and the wolf's eyes seemed fixed on him. But they were looking through him, and far beyond, past the canyon walls, to the broad, beautiful valley. After a long time, Reddy slowly backed away and sat on his haunches among the rocks. The moonlight softly flooded the scene, and the peaks on all sides showed clearly against the sky. There would be sheep and goats somewhere among those peaks, and deer and moose and caribou in the timber below. Reddy would hunt hard and bring meat to the king. He was strong, and he could run his prey to the earth, and still manage to climb the canyon with tidbits that were so fresh that the wolf could not resist eating them. So he stood up and made his way down the mountain. At dawn, Reddy was back again on the ledge, carrying a piece of deer meat in his mouth. Carefully he picked his way to the cave, where the wolf still lay, and dropped the meat beside the massive black head. The wolf did not stir, and Reddy felt puzzled. Quickly he left the cave and went hurrying back to the deer's carcass, where he found a wolverine already at work, and he fiercely chased it away. This was the king's meat, and he would bring a piece this time that the king would certainly want to eat. Again he climbed to the cave and dropped his burden beside the first piece, waiting for the wolf's head to move forward toward it, and for the great jaws to open. At length, Reddy whined and stirred the meat with his nose, to show that it was all right. He walked away and then back again. All through the day he did this, never going far before something impelled him to return. Through the night he wandered about the canyon, returning to the cave at intervals, to sit and look at the king and the untouched meat that lay in front of him. When dawn began to break and the stars to vanish in the sky, he pointed his nose toward the peaks and howled. It was the long, sad call that Johnny had once heard him make, one used by a lonely or lost wolf. The howl rose and fell and trembled, and then drifted away to nothingness. After a while, Reddy walked slowly from the canyon, and straight up the mountain with tail down and never a backward glance. The sun rose over the mountains and sent reflections shimmering over every bend on the river. The Canada jays screamed along the spruce trees, and the chipmunks, released from their winter quarters, scurried among the rocks. Green things were pushing up from the earth on all sides. Spring was in the air. From the canyon, the great black wolf continued to look out at the wilderness he loved, the peaks he'd seen so often, the shimmering silver river, the forests, the cozy glades, the beautiful valley of the porcupine. His feet would never again beat the paths of the moose and the deer, or his roar echo from one mountain to another. But did he really care? Here in this cave that he'd lived with his mate through one of the happiest, grandest years of his life. Here he'd come again, at last, to stay forever when the end was near. End of chapter 20.